If anything illustrates the way in which the currents of opinion around what constitutes great art shift over time, it's the National Gallery's attitude to the French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings. When the Irish art collector Hugh Lane offered to gift the nation a selection of works that included Renoir's Umbrellas, Bert Morisot's Summer's Day, and Manet's Music in the Tuileries Gardens, one of the trustees objected to the director in a memorandum. "I should as soon expect to hear of a Mormon service being conducted in St. Paul's Cathedral as to see an exhibition of the works of the modern French art rebels in the sacred precincts of Trafalgar Square." In spite of such strongly held views, the Hugh Lane pictures were accepted, and by 1965 the gallery would spend an extraordinary sum of £500,000 on acquiring The Bathers by the master of modern French painting, Paul Cézanne. Works by Van Gogh, Seurat and Renoir also entered the national collection, thanks to the remarkable collector and philanthropist, Samuel Courtauld.
Courtauld, a wealthy textiles magnate, had started to buy Impressionist paintings in the early 1920s, among them Monet's Water Lilies, Cézanne's Apples, and Van Gogh's self-portrait with bandaged ear. His collection adorned his house in London's Portman Square, and was then mostly given to the institute that bears his name. But by 1924, Courtauld had established a trust fund which was used to acquire Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art for the National Gallery. These were displayed initially at the Tate, which at that time was part of the same institution as the National Gallery. During the 1950s and 1960s, once they were no longer regarded as modern, the paintings were transferred from Millbank to Trafalgar Square. Among these works were Renoir's At the Theatre, Seurat's Bathers at Asnières, and Van Gogh's Sunflowers.
Van Gogh's Sunflowers painting doesn't really need much of an introduction. It might well be the most recognizable artwork in the world, certainly in the National Gallery collection. I have been working at the gallery for many years, and I would say it's a painting that visitors most often ask about. Some want to know if it's a replica. They are glad to hear it isn't. What I have noticed is that while everyone knows a sunflower from posters, t-shirts and tea towels, when they see it up close and in person, the painting color, energy and positivity really put a smile on their faces.
In the same year that Van Gogh's Sunflowers went on display at Trafalgar Square, a wealthy American art collector, Charles Bearer Wrightsman, successfully bid £140,000 for Francisco de Goya's portrait of General Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. However, the UK government blocked the purchase, and the painting was sold instead to the National Gallery. Saved for the nation, it was first put on display on the 2nd of August 1961 to much fanfare. But just 19 days later, it was stolen.
The public became intrigued by the theft, due in part to a series of anonymous and eccentric ransom notes written in block capitals and sent to the media over the course of 32 months. The first one arrived at Reuters news agency on the 31st of August 1961.
We have a copy of that ransom note in our archives. It reads, "Query not that I have the Goya. The picture is not and will not be for sale. It is for ransom, £140,000, to be given to charity." The note also gives details of features found on the back of the painting. It was clearly from the thief, but their identity and the whereabouts of the painting remained a mystery.
A government inquiry examined how the thief was able to enter and leave the gallery unchallenged, apparently through an unlocked window in the gents' lavatories. A night patrol with a guard dog called Rex was put in place while the police investigated the theft.
Here we have a poster for a reward for information leading to the safe return of the painting. It's for £5,000, a princely sum in 1961, worth about £100,000 today.
But no firm leads were forthcoming. In November 1963, the gallery's chairman, Lord Robbins, appealed to the thief on the BBC's Panorama programme.
Call it a day. You've made your protest, you've asked for a ransom, you haven't a chance of getting it. But if you were clever enough to take it, you're clever enough to find ways of sending it back.
On the last day of 1963, a call was made to the authorities about a package at the left luggage in Victoria Station, London. The contents were disturbing. A burnt object reduced to ashes.
The police arrived here at 3:25 this afternoon, just 5 minutes after their tip-off call. They feel that the 10 by 8 inch box of film papers does not contain the ashes of the Goya portrait. And they feel that the thieves are using it as an arm twister. It's pretty obvious that the thieves are trying to make it plain that the next time the box will contain the real thing.
18 months later, on the 25th of May 1965, realising perhaps that his scheme would never succeed, the thief sent a final note to the editor of the Daily Mirror, containing a left luggage ticket from Birmingham New Street railway station.
The long missing Goya had been lying in the left luggage office here for something like 16 days. But at no time did anyone suspect that the square-shaped parcel wrapped in brown paper and straw contained the missing painting. By 10 o'clock this morning, when the parcel was back in London, it had indeed been confirmed that it contained the missing Goya. Mr. Lawson, did the man give you a name at all?
Well, actually, when I did ask him for a name, he says, never mind. He was a tall man, rather sharp-featured, and his hair was rather scraggy, wasn't combed, and he spoke with a very good accent.
The mystery of who stole the portrait of Wellington was seemingly resolved 6 weeks later, when a 61-year-old former bus driver from Newcastle, Kempton Bunton, walked into a police station and confessed to the crime. He told the police he was embittered at having to pay the television licence fee from his modest income, while the government had contributed to the cost of the painting. Following a high-profile trial, he was found not guilty of stealing the painting, but guilty of stealing the frame. But that's not where this story ends. In 1969, Bunton's son John confessed to the police that he had in fact stolen the painting, but that his father had taken the blame to spare him a jail sentence.
While the Duke of Wellington portrait was still missing, the National Art Collections Fund was busy leading a vigorous and ultimately successful campaign to acquire Leonardo da Vinci's Mysterious, the Virgin and Child with St Anne and St John the Baptist, for the National Gallery. Money boxes were left in the gallery, where the work was exhibited. Reproductions were sold through national newspapers, and over 1,000 schools held bake sales to contribute to the £800,000 sale price. It was acquired in July 1962 with a special grant of £350,000 from the Civil Contingencies Fund. In some ways, it was an unusual choice for the gallery.
The National Gallery is a collection of paintings, so for a large drawing like this to enter the gallery's collection is very rare. Cartoons were usually produced by artists in preparation for a panel or a canvas or even a fresco. In this case, Leonardo seems to have produced it for its own ends. We suspect it was even exhibited. It's very highly finished. Look at the detail in the rendition of the faces and the draperies and the gestures. What's amazingly striking is the way in which the figures relate to one another. There was a real popular outpouring of enthusiasm for the acquisition of this great work by Leonardo. People wanted it to be in their gallery. They wanted it to stay in the gallery's collection. They wanted it to be available to them to enjoy.
In the years leading up to the outbreak of World War I, some trustees had doubts about French Impressionist art as the productions of a degraded craze. By 1964, the gallery's trustees had shifted their opinions on what constituted art worthy of the collection. That year, Cézanne's Bathers was purchased with a special grant and the support of the Max Reyne Foundation. The rebels were now truly ensconced in the sacred precincts of Trafalgar Square.
To the National Gallery, thousands of art lovers will be flocking to see the painting acquired by Britain for £500,000. It is, of course, Les Grandes Baigneuses by Cézanne. If we had not stepped in promptly, the masterpiece would have gone to another country, and few of our own people would ever have seen it. It's no use non-artistic persons getting hot under the collar. Culture must be served. Is the picture worth it? The general public can now judge for themselves.
We are looking at Paul Cézanne's Great Bathers, one of three works that obsessed the artist in the final decade of his life. He dies in 1906. During that final decade, he wants to paint a big, monumental, multi-figure painting of nude female bathers on the beach. For Cézanne, everything has to do with spatial relationships. At some point in developing the picture, he decides there's too much space at the top, there's not enough space at the bottom. So he folds over the top several inches of the canvas and adds more or less the same amount of space at the bottom, so there's more land for them to be on. We're in a remarkable moment here where we can see that in the conservation studios of the National Gallery, because it is about to undergo a campaign of conservation. The painting is first seen in 1906. All the modern artists are there in Paris looking at it. Picasso, Matisse, everyone realizes that this artist who has just recently died was, if you will, the father of them all, and that they must study him very closely, and that will lead them into wherever it was modern art was going.
Sir Michael Levy rose through the ranks of the National Gallery from assistant keeper to director, just as it celebrated its 150th anniversary.
Nobody knows how many visitors from all over the world come to see Nelson and his pigeons in Trafalgar Square. But they do know that 2 million people every year go into the building over on the north side of the square and come out feeling all the better for the experience. It is, of course, the National Gallery, which celebrates its 150th anniversary as the foremost art collection in the land.
Do you have a top of the pops in the gallery?
I don't think we do. I don't think it's that sort of gallery. There are galleries where perhaps the Mona Lisa is the top of their pops or whatever. I think that because of the range of masterpieces, it's much more gallery with probably 10 or 12 top of the pops.
In June 1975, Levy oversaw the opening of the gallery's latest extension, its North Galleries, by Queen Elizabeth II. This brutalist extension incorporated a smoking room, cloakrooms, and even a room without pictures where visitors could reflect on what they had seen. This expansion to the north would ultimately lead to discussions about an entirely new wing to the building's west. Indeed, the bulk of the later project's development would fall to Michael Levy's successor, Neil MacGregor.
Neil MacGregor was a student of philosophy, law and art history. The Courtauld Institute's director Anthony Blunt described him as the most brilliant pupil he ever taught. One of his great achievements during the 1990s was a rise in visitor numbers, prompted in part by the director's high public profile. MacGregor presented 3 BBC television series on art, including Making Masterpieces, a behind-the-scenes tour of the National Gallery which reminded viewers that the gallery's collection was a part of national life and inspired many to see the works for themselves.
How 3 artists painting in different centuries with different materials addressed the same problem, the painting of water.
By 1998, there were over 5 million visitors a year, with half coming from overseas.
Perhaps MacGregor's most visible achievement was the completion on the west side of the gallery of what would eventually be known as the Sainsbury Wing. Proposed by his predecessor and plagued by difficulties from the outset, it would be MacGregor who finally oversaw its opening. In 1981, the Conservative government suggested that, due to lack of public funding, the land on the so-called Hampton site, which had been acquired by the government in 1958, should be developed as a public-private partnership. The architectural competition for the new wing in 1982 required, therefore, the inclusion of commercial offices as well as public gallery space. Architects ABK's modern curved glass design, with a tower that would become the source of much controversy, was announced as the winner in 1982. The then Prince of Wales famously used a speech at the Royal Institute of British Architects to challenge the design of the winning proposal.
It looks as if we may be presented with a kind of vast municipal fire station, complete with a sort of tower that contains the siren. I would understand better this type of high-tech approach if you demolish the whole of Trafalgar Square and started again, with a single architect responsible for the entire layout. But what is proposed seems to me like a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much loved and elegant friend.
Despite going through several iterations, the design was refused planning permission in 1984. However, in April 1985, the generosity of the Sainsbury brothers, Simon, John and Timothy, revived the proposed extension after it was announced that they would fund a new wing entirely for the use of the gallery, negating the requirement for commercial space and allowing for a more sympathetic approach. The search for a new design began in 1985. The restrained but modern reinterpretation of William Wilkins' building was the concept of winning architects, Venturi, Scott Brown.
There's no question that some people won't like it. It's inevitable when you do something good and take a definite stand that there's going to be controversy, at least at the beginning. But we hope Prince Charles will like it, and especially the public will like it.
The future king's voice had been heard, and he seemed satisfied with the outcome.
I'm rather pleased, I must say, by the result. On the whole, the architect has managed very successfully with a very difficult job. What it hasn't done is to shite at the old friend. It has made a very great contribution to the gallery and I think to London.
The Sainsbury wing was opened to the public in July 1991.
From the outset, the Sainsbury wing was intended as a space where the gallery could present its celebrated collection of medieval and early Renaissance paintings. It was now possible to show these works in broadly chronological order, bringing together pictures from Italy and Northern Europe in adjoining galleries. The galleries are laid out like a basilica, the very environment in which many of these religious and devotional paintings were intended to be seen.
We've got the first contrast between the sequence of Italian rooms and the north up here with Van Eyck's Arnolfini. I wonder if it might help if you just moved it round a bit onto this wall, because then people will be drawn more into the room.
This is a painting known as the Wilton diptych, and it was made for King Richard II of England at the end of the 14th century, and we can see him with 3 saints behind him praying to the Virgin and Child, who are surrounded by 11 angels in this beautiful flowery meadow. It uses an immense amount of gold in all kinds of extraordinary techniques. There are immensely detailed patterns made with tiny little punches, and then there is a sense of texture. We can see that particularly perhaps around Richard's crown and collar, where there are little dots of paint raised up to look as though they're pearls. So this was not just a painting, but it was an object. It was made to be open and closed and picked up and taken on the king's travels. This is one of the most beautiful and precious paintings in the National Gallery, and I think particularly because we have almost nothing left from England in this period.
The opening of the Sainsbury wing in 1991 provided a home for the medieval and Renaissance paintings in our collection. It also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the gallery's history. This next chapter has been thoroughly modern in tone.
Since the early 1980s, the gallery has run residency programmes for contemporary artists. During this time, they explore new perspectives in their practices, informed by the dialogue between current ideas and historical forms of representation. The work produced during their residencies has been shared with visitors in various ways. Paul Arago's monumental painting was displayed in the Sainsbury Ring restaurant, while others opened up their studios or shared their work in exhibitions produced in dialogue with the collection. As contemporary artists have evolved in their ways of working and the subjects that they research, they have raised fresh and vital questions about the history of power and privilege. They have challenged who has been represented in the canon of European art and how our museums can be more reflective of our world today.
Through exhibitions around key works from our collection and beyond, we continue to explore new contexts and evolving narratives. From blockbusters to more intimate encounters, some of them ticketed, but many of them free, our exhibitions give viewers the opportunity to see works not only from the National Gallery, but from galleries and private collections around the world. Masterpieces by Leonardo, Raphael, and Titian, and more recent works by Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Klimt draw audiences who relish what can be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see these works up close.
Well, I started queuing at 1 o'clock this morning.
I think there were 700 when we got here. There are masses and masses of people, but they all seem perfectly happy to queue.
So cold, I think all of our toes have given up completely. The ice was frozen on the fountains in Trafalgar Square. Yep. That's how cold it is.
I was sort of dreading the queue, but I knew that it just had to be done, like one of those things that you have to see because it's not going to happen again.
There are a lot of people who go to exhibitions like this almost as a sort of pilgrimage to make contact with a genius from the past.
It was worth bearing the cold, it was worth lack of sleep. It's a piece of history in the making.
While big exhibitions may grab the headlines and bring vast crowds to Trafalgar Square, our collection and our work to expand it, care for it, research it and share it through all kinds of channels remain core aspects of the National Gallery's original mission and ongoing purpose. However, the acquisition of works of art has become increasingly costly, due in part to fewer historic works circulating on the market and increasingly intensive global competition for them. So, the creation of the National Lottery Heritage Fund in 1994 provided a new and welcome source of funding. In 1997, it enabled us to secure one of the most famous equine portraits by an English artist.
This life-size riderless horse rearing against a plain background has no precedent in Western art and is an astonishing subject for a painting. Why did George Stubbs paint this portrait of a thoroughbred horse with no rider? First, we must look at what 18th century viewers would have expected of an equestrian portrait. From antiquity onwards, this kind of painting depicted kings or generals mounted, typically in battle. Examples include the National Gallery's portraits of Charles I and Frederick Real. Stubbs was the leading horse painter of his day who had studied anatomy and even dissected horses. He was probably commissioned in 1762 by the second Marquess of Rockingham to paint Whistlejacket, his prize stallion. Whistlejacket's career as racehorse had ended by then, and he now needed advertising as a stud stallion. That is why we have a portrait of a horse like he would paint a human being. Whistlejacket commands the canvas in splendid isolation and is associated with majesty and superior rank. A room was specially created to display the painting at Rockingham's home, Wentworth Woodhouse in South Yorkshire, England. Despite suggestions that a rider was originally planned, Whistlejacket was always meant to be unmounted. Free from human control, the riderless horse embodies a free spirit that prefigures Romanticism's celebration of nature.
Following its purchase, Whistlejacket went on a tour of galleries round the UK, timed to coincide with nearby horse racing events. The chestnut stallion was also projected onto the Sainsbury wing at night until the police intervened, as it was said to be distracting motorists. The acquisition of Whistlejacket was followed in the first 2 decades of the new millennium by 3 significant purchases, supported by a variety of public fundraising campaigns and private philanthropy. Raphael's Madonna of the Pinks and 2 paintings from Titian's Poesie depicting scenes from the myth of Diana, goddess of the hunt, joined a collection that represents women in many forms, as classical goddess, queen, seductress, allegorical figure, society woman, patron of the arts, and even as artist, as we see in various gallery paintings including Manet's portrait of Eva Gonzalez and Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun's own self-portrait in a straw hat.
However, in a collection of over 2,300 works, there are very few actually painted by women. And while we can't control the fact that historically there have been few female artists who received the recognition during their lifetimes which their talent deserved, we have made it a priority to acquire their works when possible. And there is no better example than the work by Artemisia Gentileschi, Self-Portrait of St. Catherine of Alexandria, acquired in 2018 after an extraordinary number of funding contributions.
Artemisia is without doubt the most celebrated female artist of the 17th century, and it has been on our wish list here at the gallery to have a painting by her for a very long time. In 1611, when she was just 17, something happened that really changed her life, both professionally and personally. She was raped by the painter Agostino Tassi. A long trial followed, and we know the details of that trial because the documents survive, and we know that Artemisia was tortured and she was subjected to really grueling questioning. Tassi was prosecuted, but his punishment was never enforced. In this painting, Artemisia decided to portray herself as St. Catherine of Alexandria. The 4th century Saint St. Catherine was tortured. She was tied to a wheel with iron spikes, and she was miraculously rescued by divine intervention. And here she is putting her hand on the wheel, the instrument of her torture, and you can see here that it's broken. And what I love about this picture is it shows her as a martyr saint. She's holding the palm. She was later beheaded, but actually she shows her resilience, a sort of quiet resilience in this picture.
The painting toured the UK to visit a series of unusual and unexpected locations, including a school in Newcastle, a GP surgery in Pocklington, and a women's prison in Surrey. And in 2020, we put this painting centre stage in an exhibition dedicated to the artist herself. As rare as female artists in the collection may be, it's our role to foreground these rule breakers and trailblazers. Artists such as Rachel Rausch, Rosa Bonheur, and Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun. They are integral to the story of art that we tell in the gallery.
The National Gallery collection has a special place in the heart of the nation. Of the 2,400 or so paintings that make up the collection, many were acquired due to generous gifts, from Prince Albert's bequest to the funds raised by schools for the Leonardo cartoon. And the collection continues to grow thanks to the support of the public, often through legacy gifts. The purchase of Adolphe Menzel's Afternoon in the Tuileries Gardens and Max Pechstein's Portrait of Charlotte Kurt were made possible by provision of land in the will of Mrs. Martha Bailey. A gift dedicated to her conservation work was made by Miss Pauline Matthews, in memory of her father, John Sidney Matthews, the owner of Manod Quarry, where the gallery stored and preserved much of its collection for World War II. The acquisition of 2 early 20th century works, Sorolla's The Drunkard and Ferdinand Haller's The Kind Valley, were supported by the legacy gift of David Leslie Mead, honoring his wish that the gallery should extend its collection beyond the 1900s. With over 1/4 of the collection coming from gifts from the public, either as paintings or donations to buy paintings, the National Gallery truly is the People's Gallery.
We've looked back over 200 extraordinary years of history of the National Gallery, from our origins in a private house in Pall Mall to our current home in bustling Trafalgar Square. Over many decades of transformation and development, there's been one steady focus. We acquire, display, research, and care for a great collection of paintings for this nation and beyond. I've been visiting the gallery since I was a child, and I feel extraordinarily privileged to have been director here since 2015. As we celebrate our 200th anniversary, I invite you to be part of this ongoing story. Children and families, scholars, tourists, and art lovers, and all those who explore our collections and exhibitions online from afar. The National Gallery belongs to all of us. It makes the great art of the past present to us. It enables us to experience works of remarkable beauty and skill, to learn, to enjoy, to wonder, to be more connected to each other. It's my hope as director to continue to share the legacy of the People's Gallery with you. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the next 200 years were as amazing as the last?